The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. President Donald Trump has deployed 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles in response to escalating immigration protests, overriding Governor Gavin Newsom's objections in a rare and controversial use of federal authority. Now, the move follows the arrest of at least 44 people by federal immigration agents, part of a broader nationwide crackdown that has already led to thousands of daily detentions. Citing Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Trump justified the deployment as a measure to protect federal personnel and property. But the decision has reignited debate over states' rights, the limits of presidential power, and the role of the military in domestic unrest. Was Trump's order justified, or is this likely a show of power? Well, joining us today to share more is Dr Jessica Genauer, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University. Hi, Dr. Genauer. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the program again.
All right. Well, Dr. Genauer, protests in and around Los Angeles erupted on Friday after federal immigration agents arrested at least 44 people. How have the unrest unfolded the past 3 days? Has it, now escalated into widespread civil unrest?
Yeah, that's right. So we have seen over the last few days sparked off by arrests that were made by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement personnel, so often called ICE, in Los Angeles. So these are arrests of people who are suspected to be illegally in America. But from what we understand, there have been a lot of arrests made. Some seem to be in error, or even arrests that are made of people who are in California illegally, essentially, have been done in quite a widespread and brutal way. So then we had these protests breaking out against these ICE law enforcement personnel. And as a response to that, President Trump then escalated further by bringing in a National Guard or deploying a National Guard to actually patrol and control protesters on the streets with U.S. law enforcement.
Well, President Donald Trump ordered the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to quell immigration protests over in Los Angeles. But was his order justified, Dr. Genauer? I mean, what was his reasoning behind the deployment of such troops?
Yeah, so this is quite interesting. This is something very, very rare to have a sort of a federal deployment of National Guard troops at a state level. So essentially the National Guard are a state-level sort of military force that are usually only deployed at the request of the state governor. But in this case, the governor of California did not want the National Guard deployed, and Trump went ahead and overruled that. Now, he does have some powers to do that at the federal level, but he can only do that if he says that either the US is being invaded, which is not obviously the case here, or if he says it's not possible to enforce federal laws, or if he says, which is the justification that he used, that there's risk of domestic rebellion. So there's actually a risk of rebellion from US citizens. So that's kind of the clause that Trump has called into effect in order to justify employing from a federal level this National Guard onto the streets, even though the governor of California actually objects.
But is this move a likely show of, say, power from Trump?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that this is Trump showing that he's not afraid to escalate a situation and to call in law enforcement at a high level. So we've seen this from Trump time and again, not necessarily just in the domestic context within the United States, but also in the way that Trump relates to other countries in the international arena, that Trump is not so much into negotiations, he's not into slow decision-making processes, he's not into kind of, lengthy attempts to try to reach agreement. He would rather escalate quickly and decisively in quite an abrupt way. So that's what we're seeing again here, that Trump's immediate response to some protests on the street was to then escalate and call in at a federal level another law enforcement body to patrol the streets of Los Angeles and other cities in California. So yes, I think this is Trump trying to show that he is more powerful or has more levers of power than those protesters on the streets.
Well, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, this invocation of presidential powers has remained, dormant for decades. Now, the Trump's federalization of National Guard troops marks the first time a U.S. chief executive has used such powers since 1992. So, Dr. Genauer, does this signify an escalation that challenges both state authority and long-established standards? Is this a breach of state sovereignty?
Yeah, I think that it does show that Trump is willing to violate what have been sort of unwritten norms of behaviour for many decades in the US context. So whilst the power exists for a president to federally override a state governor and send in a National Guard force onto the streets of cities in that state, it's something that just doesn't usually happen. And even when it happened in 1992, it was at the request of the state governor. So this is just very unusual. So yes, it is violating these long-established standards, as you said. It's violating norms, and it's showing that Trump is very willing to sort of break norms and systems along the way as he goes through his second administration and takes these kind of escalatory moves.
Is the deployment of the National Guard without California's consent constitutional, though? I mean, will this have any implication on Trump?
So it doesn't directly contradict the Constitution in that there is a clause for the president to say, okay, there's a risk of rebellion, I need to override the state, the state authority, and I need to now do this from a federal level. So there is a clause there that could justify it, but I think certainly it will be contested. Like there will be sort of a disagreement over whether or not Trump actually, can legitimately say that there's a risk of rebellion in this case, which is what he would need to say. And I think that the implications for Trump more broadly are that it shows that Trump really sees himself primarily as representing a particular segment of US society, so his own core support base, and that he's not afraid at all to go up in quite an aggressive way against segments of the US population that he doesn't see to be as belonging to his constituency or his side. So there's almost like subnational fractures here that Trump is creating in the way that he's addressing this situation.
Well, California says it is likely to file a lawsuit here. How strong is California's legal case then? I mean, what are the chances the courts will side with the state over the federal government?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer myself, but I would say that there's a pretty strong case to be made that Trump was, not justified. I mean, his side would try to argue that, yes, there was a fear of rebellion, and so therefore they had to call in the National Guard. But I think you could equally argue that there were some protesters on the street, largely peaceful, before the National Guard came in, and that actually this was an exaggerated or escalatory response to something, that response was not required. So I think there will be a strong case to be made, but it still shows, in the meantime, the National Guard is deployed on the streets. So it still shows that sort of escalation can happen, violence can happen, damage can be done before things get to go through the courts and be determined, what is the exact legality in this case.
Well, human rights advocacy organization Amnesty International also criticized the so-called dangerous deployment of National Guard troops, which the executive director says is to target and punish those who speak out in defense of human rights. Could this move by Trump be a violation of human rights, Dr. Genauer?
I don't know whether, again, I'm not a lawyer myself, so I wouldn't probably personally say that that is the exact angle in this case, that it's going to be considered a violation of human rights. I think it's more going to be considered a violation of the law in the sense that, national security law, in the sense that there's not actually a justifiable case to say that the protests on the street constituted an imminent rebellion against US government, essentially, would be the justification that would be needed in order to deploy the National Guard troops into a state without, not at the request of the state governor.
Well, circling back here, Dr. Genauer, we earlier spoke about how the last time the troops were called was back in 1992. Now, back in 1992, the last time such a power was ignited was when the Los Angeles riots erupted after 4 white police officers were acquitted in the beating of black motorist Rodney King. How do the 1992 riots compare with the protests that we're seeing now?
So those riots were, escalated even further than what we're seeing now and were more widespread. But I think a key difference, as I mentioned, is that in that case, the governor of California actually asked for the National Guard to be deployed. So I think that what we're seeing here that's quite different is that this is almost the federal government against a state government. So we're seeing essentially a risk of violence between a subnational section of the United States against federal, central federal government. And I think that that's something that's quite different and that is quite risky in terms of the implications for where this might go.
Well, overall, do you see the LA protests escalating even further after Trump's move?
I think that they could. I think it really depends what happens from now. So if the courts rule that actually it was not legitimate to deploy the National Guard and they get essentially pulled back, so we might see a quick de-escalation. But if we keep seeing this, ICE law enforcement personnel, so the Immigration and Customs Enforcement going through towns, arresting people who they think, are in the US illegally, we might see further outbreaks of violence in future. And I think what is quite risky about this situation is that it's all very volatile. So we really see that Trump is a president who's not afraid to escalate. But once there is violence on the streets, then we have a risk that those protesters are going to escalate as well. So, yes, I think there is a real risk that we could see further violence in coming days or weeks.
Okay. Well, this all comes, as you've just said, after ICE has ramped up arrests in recent weeks, averaging about 2,000 detentions per day nationwide. Now, the stepped-up enforcement is part of Trump's vow to carry out the largest deportation campaign in U.S. history. Are there any specific communities or ethnicities that are being targeted the most here?
Well, what we seem to see is that it's really people from Central American nations who seem to be most targeted in these arrests and ones who are most commonly, suspected of being part of a population that might be in the US illegally. So there is definitely that sort of racial or ethnic dimension to the way in which this law enforcement orders are being carried out.
But what does Trump hope to achieve politically or strategically by launching, the so-called largest deportation campaign in U.S. history? Is it primarily about immigration control or something more?
So I think that for Trump personally, almost everything he does is trying to play to his core support base. So I think that these immigration control orders have actually been very popular with his key supporters, and it's something that are, really sort of endorsed by his own constituency. And I think that Trump knows that, and he doesn't really care if there are other large parts of the US population that might be opposed or might not be supporting, because he doesn't see them as sort of his key support base that he needs to speak to and to kind of take care of in order to stay in power. So I would say that for Trump, the main motivation is actually about his domestic popularity and maintaining that popularity with his core support base.
Some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Dr. Genauer, for your time and your insights today.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. That was Dr. Jessica Genauer, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.